Welcome, everybody. Glad to see you all here. I'm Dee Dee Ruggles. I don't know why I'm looking at this sheet of paper to tell you my name, but I have to do that. Otherwise, I do forget to tell people my name because I just assume that I know who I am. I'm not having an identity crisis. I'm the director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, and I want to welcome you to the Modern Critical Theory Lecture Series. And as always, we begin with a land acknowledgement. A reminder that we're on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations, lands that were the traditional territory of Native nations prior to their forced removal. The land continues to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. The Unit for Criticism has a commitment to presenting work about indigeneity and to the work of Indigenous scholars. And before introducing tonight's speaker, also I want to remind you that when the Modern Critical Theory Lecture Series reconvenes after the break, we will hear from Abdul Malik Simon from the University of Sheffield in the UK, who will be speaking on urbanism and the politics of space. I'm actually very excited about his talk. Of course, I do work on space. He will be talking to us from the UK, and so for that reason, we will have a webinar format. Usually I don't like the webinar, I think we have better conversations when we're here together, looking at each other and reading each other's expressions. All right, tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from our colleague, Robert Markley, Trowbridge professor and head of the Department of English. In addition to his primary appointment in English, Bob has affiliations with the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory and the Center for East Asian and Pacific Studies. He is a prolific writer on a great range of topics, from 18th century studies to science fiction and new media. And he's the author of numerous books. I'm just going to skip right over the articles and book chapters. In 1988, he wrote Two-Edged Weapons, Style and Ideology in the Comedies of Etheridge, Wycherley, and Congreve. I hope I'm pronouncing the names right. You know, I do belong to a different world. That was, I said, 1988. 1993, Fallen Languages, Crises of Representation in Newtonian England, 1660 to 1740. In 1996, Virtual Realities and Their Discontents, that was an edited volume. In 2005, Dying Planet, Mars in Science and the Imagination. And in 2006, The Far East and the English Imagination, 1600 to 1730. In 2006, I mean, the list goes on and on. 2016, Writing China, Essays on the Amherst Embassy in 1816 and the Sino-British Cultural Relations, and that was again an edited volume, a co-edited volume with Peter Kitson. And then 2019, Kim Stanley Robinson, Modern Masters of Science Fiction. That's really quite a range of topics you've covered. And now, capitalism. So thank you, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Dee Dee, for the generous introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, good. There are a number of scholars who I'd like to thank, but the list is too numerous. Most of them are in China, many of them are in China. We haven't been able to sit down in person for obvious reasons for a number of years, and I'll end by talking about them. So I apologize for the misdirection in the title, but what I originally designed, as I was telling Dee Dee beforehand, is basically an 8-week lecture course, which I realized I'd better cut down. So I'm going to focus on both historical and theoretical questions. The historical questions, I think, will become evident rather quickly. But my basic argument is that the very concepts that we use to define economic theory, even today, are, I'm asking this as a question in one of the slides, but I will just say, are not transhistorical, transcultural, general principles. They are historically situated and in many cases overdetermined and specifically Eurocentric ideas. So, these are some of the questions to keep in mind. The general transhistorical principles of what we call capitalism stand up to revisionist historical inquiry. Do our understandings of capitalism implicitly reproduce Whiggish and Marxian, that is, Eurocentric versions of progressive development? And what does a symmetrical anthropology of 17th and 18th century capitalism suggest? As many of you know, symmetrical anthropology is a term I'm borrowing from Bruno Latour. So I think my own answers to these questions will become evident, but we'll go from there. Okay, so since the publication of Ken Pomerantz's landmark study, The Great Divergence, in 2000, China has become a focal point for revisionist accounts of the world economy. So basically the argument of Pomerantz and related scholars is that before 1800, the entire world economic order was quite literally Sinocentric. So that rather being hamstrung by what Karl Marx termed its quote-unquote Asiatic mode of production and stunted by its quote-unquote Oriental despotism, China served as the economic engine for the entire early modern world, the most populous, wealthiest, and among the most technologically sophisticated nations before the Industrial Revolution. So this is basically the argument that Pomerantz advanced in 2000. There have been lots of discussions back and forth. The date of 1800 that was on his original title has been kind of pushed back to the 1760s. But he produced compelling evidence that living standards and socioeconomic development were in advanced areas of China, not the Western hinterlands, were comparable to England and the Netherlands, at least through 1750. That labor markets in China and Japan were freer than they were in England and France. That the Qing government fostered increased productivity through technological advances in small industries and innovative agricultural practices. That the diet of Chinese peasants and urban laborers was comparable to that of their counterparts in Northwestern Europe, and so were their living standards, life expectancies, and infant mortality rates. These are all standards that economists or economic historians use to talk about various stages of development to compare across boundaries of whatever sort. So in answering why the Industrial Revolution occurred in Britain and not China, Pomerantz comes up with what has proved to be, over the last 23 years, a very influential thesis. England modernized after 1800 because of its unique combination of cheap and abundant coal and imported raw materials from its North American colonies. Just to explain this a little bit, along with other of the so-called group of California historians, and including Jack Goldstone, sorry, I lost the name for a minute, Jack Goldstone here. The argument is that all advanced countries tend to run into cul-de-sacs at similar points in time. I'd recommend Goldstone's book, Rebellion and Revolution in the Early Modern World, which is very interesting on the 17th century. And so England, China, France, at the end of the 18th century, were running into this combination of too many people, pressure on elites to provide services which could not be provided, and decreases in available agricultural land. So England lucks out because it colonizes North America, not South America, which was always its preferred colony of choice, at least in the English imagination. so that the monocultures of colonial sugar and cotton, which are of course predicated on slave labor, provided England with a crucial influx of resources when its agriculture and forests could no longer keep pace with its rapidly increasing population. So I see a couple of Victorianists here, and you know that the population of England shot up dramatically after about 1720. And so it turns out that if you look at diets of laborers in England and their families in the 19th century, as opposed to, say, the 17th century, a lot of the calories are that came from bread, in particular, and various vegetables, were replaced by sugar in the diet. So Pomerantz concludes that ecological factors, ecological broadly conceived, were far more important than social liberalization, financial capitalism, or technological innovation. So if we were sitting here 50 years ago, this would, in a room at the University of Illinois, this would sound like heresy. And the reason is because we tie the development of capitalism to the advent of liberalism, particularly liberal individualism, and to our conceptions of political progress, the rebellion in the American colonies, the French Revolution, and so on. Pomerantz basically says that there are other factors, primarily resource management, scarcity of resources, which are far more determinative of cultural historical change. So, Pomerantz has spawned a whole number of books, somebody on the left there, of studies of the 17th and 18th century from what's basically a Sinocentric, or at least Asian-centric perspective. And I'd call your attention to Ashley Abel Millar's The Singular Case. I know this is hard to read, but the bottom subtitle here, Debating China's Political Economy in the European Enlightenment. And she does a very good job, particularly on French intellectual history. And she points out, I think quite rightly, that all the economic theories that are being produced in the 18th century run up against this exception, this singular case of China as an economically powerful, literally still the center of the world economy, nation that defies all the prescriptions that are being applied to countries in Europe in terms of social, political, and progressive development. And so I think what the spate of books has done is make the case that people in Europe were aware of this, acutely aware of this. It's not like they thought they were living at the apex of the world, and they had this dominant economic system, sorry about that. They all recognized that living standards were as high in China. They all wanted Chinese goods. They're all willing to pay for them in gold. And the problem was accounting for this anomaly. So I'm skipping ahead. I mean, you could buy a copy of my book if you want to read the earlier stuff, but you skip ahead to the end of the 18th century. For many of Smith's contemporaries, that is in the second half of the 18th century, China remained the apex of civilization. So the Scots philosopher James Dunbar wrote, and you see the quotation there, if the honors of nations were in reality to be estimated by riches, by population, by the antiquity of arts, or by the stability and duration of civil government, it is not any of the European nations. It is the Chinese and the Indians, that is South Asia, who must be placed at the head of this species. And this is a fairly common view. This is 1782. And even Adam Smith, who's both kind of the hero and villain of this slide, says, China has long been one of the richest, that is one of the most fertile, best cultivated, most industrious, and most populous countries in the world. It seems, however, to have been long stationary. Marco Polo, who visited more than 500 years ago, describes its cultivation, industry, and populousness almost in the same terms in which they are described by travelers in the present time. Now, here's the crux of critical argument. Smith's description of the static nature of the Chinese economy, and really Chinese society as a whole, relies on armchair knowledge, secondhand accounts dating back to the 14th century, in order to promote his view that China suffers from the paradoxes of prosperity. In other words, because Smith believes that China, however prosperous, has neither the land, the resources, nor the ability to, quote unquote, grow, he turns to anecdotal evidence to declare that the empire is stagnant rather than, as he calls it, thriving. So for those of you who are familiar with Smith, thriving is a critical term in his view of political economy, because he wants to tie the idea of progress, well, to the Scots Enlightenment, and to this idea that we are moving post 1688 and the Glorious Revolutions towards what we would now call a more democratic, or at least republican, form of society. So in such a mindset, in such a scenario, China is obviously going to stand out as, Millar says, a singular case, a great exception. So what Smith does is make an important move that I think has been underestimated in the history of economics. Cross-cultural comparisons before the end of the 18th century tended to focus on elites, on comparison to elites. So you find hundreds of examples talking about how polite and civil the upper classes are in India, in China, in Johor, all across South and Southeast Asia. Smith turns to focusing on laborers, on working people. And this is what he says. Chinese artificers, instead of waiting indolently in their workhouses for the calls of their customers, as in Europe, are continually running about the streets with the tools of their respective trades, offering their service and, as it were, begging employment. Now, so what members of the Chamber of Commerce or the faculty in Geiss might see as the virtues of a free market: initiative, self-promotion, mobility, customer satisfaction, Smith sees as evidence that, as he says, the poverty of the lower ranks of people in China far surpasses that of the most beggarly nations of Europe, a country he obviously had never been to. Now, the plight of these quote-unquote artificers, that is the working classes, is reinforced by reports that in the neighborhood of Canton, many hundred, it is commonly said, many thousands of families have no habitation on the land, but live constantly in little fishing boats upon rivers and canals. And there you get to one of the basic prejudices of Smithian economics. For British gentlemen, the lack of a freehold, a tenancy, a cottage, a workshop, dooms these families to the levels of beggars or vagabonds, when in reality, living on the water in if any of you have ever been to that region of China, living on the water makes sense when it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit out, for large chunks of the year. So I am an English professor, so I'd call attention to the literary construction, it is commonly said, because it becomes a foundation for an economic philosophy that lends itself to appropriation and to what are going to become in the 19th century Orientalist visions of China as a decaying and quote-unquote beggarly empire. There's a lot more to be said about the McCartney embassies in the 1790s and in the Amherst Embassy, yeah, in 1816, which are quite interesting. But I want to jump ahead to the middle of the 19th century since I am talking about capitalism. The larger version of this argument goes like this. You've got to read Karl Marx's economic theories in the wake of Britain's defeat of China, the Qing Empire, and the two Opium Wars. And that in many respects, scholars of East-West relations are still struggling with that legacy of the Opium Wars, the decisive assertion of British military and commercial power that brought geopolitics in line with the orientalization, trivialization, and demonization of China that we see. So I'll turn now to articles that Marx and Engels wrote in English for the New York Tribune in the 1850s in the aftermath of the First Opium War. So Marx declares that China's economic isolation having come to a violent end, the empire's dissolution must follow as surely as that of any mummy carefully preserved in a hermetically sealed coffin whenever it is brought into contact with the open air. So this is English, not a translation from German. So you can see how the language there is constructing China literally as a kind of, mummified, backward-looking, sclerotic empire. Now, to be clear, Marx grants the moral high ground to the Chinese in their efforts to ban the importation of opium, but he assumes that the Qing Empire is, I love this quote, vegetating in the teeth of time as a semi-barbarian society, contriving to dupe itself with delusions of celestial perfection. And so he's mimicking there the Qing dynasty language. So, not to be outdone, Engels, who writes some of the columns for Marx, jumps in 1857 and describes China as the rotting semi-civilization of the oldest state in the earth. So, I don't think you need to be an MFA or PhD in English literature to see how this language is working, right? The critical thing, the point I would make here, is that Marx's language does not match up in ways that you might assume it does with the status, the economic status of China, even as late as the 1850s. So what's at stake? I've given you this quick guided tour of Pomerantz and the Pomerantzians, I guess I'm one of those. What does a sinocentric history do to our understanding of the origins and development of capitalism? I want to now turn to a really key problem, a case study really, in traditional and even some post-colonial accounts of the intersections of Western capitalism and colonialism, and that is the history, early history of the East India Company prior to 1755. And I'm going to focus on a specific incident, and that is the East India Company's disastrous loss in 1689, 1690, to the Mughal Empire in the so-called Mughal War that the company declared. Okay. This is not just a case study. I think the history is important because it drives this, as we'll see, it drives narratives to this day about colonialism, Eurocentric concepts of the growth and the development of international commerce. So I'm turning now to some of the classic texts, and there's I got plenty more of these if anybody wants a bibliography. Some classic texts in constructing the East India Company. And you can see by the titles as a kind of key player in the development of modern economics. I call your attention particularly to Nick Robbins. the corporation that changed the world of the East India Company shaped the modern multinational. Nick Robbins is an interesting guy. He's actually a banker. He is not a scholar. And his publisher was Pluto Press. The title that he had was much more scholarly sounding. That's the publicist's title about the company that shaped the modern multinational corporation. Philip Stern is Miles Ogburn and Emily Erickson are the unholy trinity, in my view, of his historians of the East India Company. What they've all focused on is the company's modes of internal communication, which I now want to spend some time trying to deconstruct. So these are some sample quotes. Emily Erickson says, the East India Company is one of the most important companies to understanding the evolution of the modern world. It's like page 3. Robbins calls it the corporation that shaped the modern multinational. Philip Stern argues that even in the 17th century, the company was generally successful in its efforts to administer laws, collect taxes, provide protection, regulate economic, religious, and civic life, conduct diplomacy and wage war, make claims to jurisdiction over land and sea, and cultivate authority over and obedience from those people subject to its commands. And the title of this book, as you saw, is The Company State. And so Stern holds the view that this is kind of the origin of a kind of colonial authority, which tends towards the absolute, and its ambitions tend towards the absolute. And K.M. Chaudhry, who's really the kind of dean of historians of the East India Company, as he says in the late 17th century, went from strength to strength, and its bonds bearing fixed rate interest were regarded as the ideal short-term investment in both London and Amsterdam. But a group of revisionist historians, and these are actually from 2 special issues of journals that you can access, whose basic point is, wait a second, dude, and calling into question this kind of Eurocentric history of the East India Company. So the first quotation is the Eurocentric bias comes with the privileging of European companies in histories of the Indian Ocean, has skewed understandings of the regions and its culture, and led to a history that is heavily reliant on the extensive archives of the European East India companies. That's a special issue of 18th century studies from 2015, maybe 2016. But Su Fong Eng edited a special issue of the journal Genre in 2015. And she talks about Chakraborty's project of provincializing Europe calls attention to the fissures and gaps in the European archive itself that demand new interpretations and a re-examination of assumptions of European dominance. So this is where we this is where we are at the moment. Full disclosure, I have an article in that Su Fong Eng special issue of Genre, which you're going to hear little bits of, updated bits of in a minute. So the problem is this: that these vast archives of the East India Company that are available to scholars. These are letters that were written from people in India back to offices in England. So very briefly, East India Company officials required that their agents operating anywhere in South and Southeast Asia, from ship's captains to bookkeepers to president, the term means head of the trading post, the factory, keep detailed accounts of their trade from year to year. So these letters came from Surat, what's now Mumbai, Fort St. George, which is now Madras, and Calcutta, went far beyond mere tallies of figures to include extensive descriptions of political, agricultural, and economic conditions. That is the kind of detailed information needed by the company's directors, or getting them letters months and months later to make informed decisions about what cargoes to send next, what commodities to seek in return that would make a profit for them in England, and how to respond to local merchants and officials. So this is like 17th century internet, except it takes months for things to get back. So the company's records are what all those scholars who I noted before are actually working with. And this is why Ang and Riello and others, Deepesh Chakraborty as well, have a lot of difficulty, because we're basically getting a Eurocentric series of reports tailored to the directors of a private company in London purporting to tell the truth. And so a number of us have been looking for years for accounts that contradict these accounts, or at least challenge these East India Company accounts. I could write an 800-page footnote about the state of archives of trading with, from South Asian points of view. Most of these records are still in private hands of private families. Very hard to access. The other problem is that the Indian Ocean in the 18th century, multiple navies fighting multiple battles all the time. And so the last thing you wanted to be caught with were correspondence that listed, where you were going and who you were selling to and how much money you had on board and so on. So you're going to turn to one of the best books written in the 18th century, Alexander Hamilton's A New Account of the East Indies. No, not that Alexander Hamilton. And I'm actually really pissed at this guy's mother for naming him Alexander and not James, because I would have already published a book called The Life and Times of James Hamilton, and that, not the guy on the $20 bill, was what a literary agent in Hong Kong suggested I call the book if I ever wrote it. So Hamilton's a hoot. So he's a Scots merchant who had a 35-year career in the East Indies, mostly as an independent trader and a thorn in the side of the East India Company. He's often the only eyewitness who is not a company official or a company flag at critical events. He also was fluent in Persian, in several Malay dialects, and Pidgin Portuguese, which tended to be the lingua franca of trade in the Indian Ocean. And he was friendly with merchants and rulers across the region. And we know this because the Sultan of Johor offered him the island of Singapore as a gift if he'd stay there and be his finance minister. And he took one look at this kind of swampy little island and said, nah, and went sailing off. Now, not to make claims for the truth value of his account, but we know that at several points, the East India Company hired him to assume naval control of company ships in on-again, off-again war with the Maratha navies. This is a long, complicated history that has not been disentangled about who's fighting what and when. We have accounts of battles. We have different accounts depending on which, from South Asia, because there's rivalry and actual warfare between various ports on particularly the west coast of South Asia. Every time the company gets in trouble, they hire Hamilton to help try to help them out, and then he quits. He gets fed up, and when he quits, and we'll find out why. So the antagonist in this drama is Josiah Child, who was a director of the East India Company. if you pick up an economic textbook, or if you pick up Marx' Das Kapital, Child plays an important role as a quote-unquote economic theorist. He was the most popular 17th century writer on economics, not William Petty, who coined the term political arithmetic, but Daniel Defoe, that guy, in The Anatomy of Exchange Alley, called him that original of stock jobbing. And stock jobbing is an 18th century term for money manipulation. Child's book that everyone knows is called A New Discourse of Trade, but he is basically a crook. And it's interesting that if you look at 17th century economic writers who make it into economic textbooks, the other one is Nicholas Barbon, all crooks. So it's like listening to Elon Musk, narrate the history of how economics works. So the East India Company defeat in the Mughal War in 1686-19. Alexander Hamilton is actually there at the Mughals' court, and he speaks Persian. So this is really the only eyewitness account we have of the surrender of and the ritual humiliation of the East India Company at Aurangzeb's court. So England, the East India Company loses this war. Hamilton has both horrifying and at the same time funny chapters about the ineptitude of the English forces and the inability of the East India Company to part with its money to pay the mercenaries who are fighting for them. So they don't pay the mercenaries leave, and the East India Company official account is about renegades and desertion and blah, blah, blah. And Hamilton is, has some very funny passages about the English. So the UIUC goes to court to get its trading permit, which is called a firman, back. So through the intercession of a Surat merchant whose name has come down to us, the ambassadors for the UIUC, which included a Jewish merchant and one of the company's traders, that's it, by the special assistance of presents to the officers at court, that is, they bribed their way into Aurangzeb's presence, after a new mode of ambassadors, their hands being tied by a sash before them, and they were obliged to prostrate. So if you can see the writing at the bottom, this is a French 18th century version of this humiliation. The English asked for pardon from Aurangzeb for their offenses. Their hands are behind their back, they're not in front of them, which is what Hamilton reports. That's John Child, no relation to Josiah Child, who actually wasn't there either. But you can see 1780, middle of the endless wars between England and France. French love this. And this illustration is recycled numerous times. So I think one of the things that we begin to learn is that Hamilton provides us with a kind of counter-narrative to the official narrative from the East India Company. And I think that serves a larger purpose of reminding us not to take the accounts in the East India Company records as legitimate. Even the bills of lading are semiotic instruments that have to be decoded, that are hedged in by various rules, regulations, and so on, as well as, frankly, outright financial fraud. Just skip ahead here. So eventually what the ambassadors do is sign articles on behalf of the East India Company that go like this. Basically, the East India Company is sending back profits not from trade, but from basically acting as pirates in the Indian Ocean, capturing ships, capturing cargoes. They weren't the only one, but Aurangzeb made them return all of their booty, which was about 60% of what they had on hand. The English had to pay reparations of 150,000 rupees, which is a significant sum. Basically, the Mughal forces burned down the English trading post in Bombay. Presidency had to return to Surat, farther up the coast, less profitable venture because there was more competition, particularly from Arabian merchants. John Child, who was the head of the company office there, who started the war, was exiled, although he conveniently died before that could be carried out. Bombay was reduced from hundreds of men to a trading post of 60, trying to make money in the dung trade as fertilizer, which is something that will come down. And this loss of trade had crucial impact, as you can see, on the East India Company imports to England. My rule of thumb is multiply these figures by 1,100 to get kind of a rough equivalent in today's in today's numbers. So you can see in 1684, before the war, a significant return that drops to 1/10 of the previous return by 1691. In 1692, when word gets back and all these articles of surrender are put in place, it's down to 30,000. 1693 and 1694, the East India Company is desperately trying to renegotiate its license act as a monopoly. And then once that's settled, we're still down at 30,000 pounds a year. So this is the East India Company's own records of how bad the defeat was at the time. So let's return to our friend back in London, Josiah Child. So at this point in 1692, after word got back, there are all sorts of critics in England saying, break up the monopoly, let free trade, as they understood it, reign in South Asia. Child tried to outface his critics, despite the surrender of Bombay, and wrote that the war, beyond all men's opinion, has ended to the eternal honor of the English nation in those parts of the world, and a peace concluded upon honorable articles, except if you have your hands bound in front of you and are like lying on the ground in front of the Emperor whimpering. So, John Child conveniently dies before he can become exiled. And John Thaw, the new president of the Surat factory, gets a letter from Child. This is in 1696. So Child orders him to exercise, quote, the power of condemning the company's enemies, or such as should be deemed so, particularly those who should dare to question the company's power over all the British subjects in India. And Child then follows up with, he expects his orders from time to time should be observed and obeyed as statute laws. So, well, as you see, promises to acquit himself with integrity and justice and adhere to the laws of the country. And then I think this is the key sentence for this, important theorist of economics in the late 17th century. So Child wrote roundly to Mr. Law that he expected his orders were to be his rules and not the laws of England, which were a heap of nonsense, compiled by a few ignorant country gentlemen who hardly knew how to make laws for the good of the government of their own private families, much less for regulating of companies in foreign commerce. Okay? Insert your own Elon Musk joke right here. But you can see this attitude of Child's. Now, we know what this is a copy of a letter that Hamilton got because he and Vaugh were on a prison ship after the Captain Avery, the famous pirate, had kidnapped the Mogul's daughter on the way to her betrothal. In Hamilton's ventriloquizing of Child's letter, he effectively turns Child into a kind of bombastic caricature, the satiric antithesis of Aurangzeb. And the threat to commerce in the region comes from the monopolistic strategies, tyrannical desires, and largely inept management of the company, not from the Mughal government, or not from the Mughal, traders. So this lambasting of Child is indicative of Hamilton's implicit identification with Mughal authorities rather than the Britons and the company's employees. So while he was in India, Hamilton, like every other European, played the submissive role as a foreigner that was required of him at the court. So the tenuousness of the East India Company's and of independent traders' positions in 17th century India leads Hamilton to cast the English in the role of dutiful employees who prosper once they leave the company's service. I won't read the whole thing here, but the important point is the Mughal subjects have these large, fine ships that trade all over India. They like the English to get the Portuguese. And the merchants allow the English very handsome salaries and indulgences. So captains had from 10 to 15 pounds per month, maids from 6 to 9, and gunners and boatswains also had good salaries, besides the privilege of carrying some goods and merchandise freight free. And that's an important distinction, because when you got back to England with whatever you brought from the East, there were all sorts of duties levied on them by officials in London who boarded the ships. So you could reserve certain amounts of that, or certain people could be allowed allowances. And so this is what the quote unquote Moorish ship owners, as Hamilton calls them, are doing. Now, this Mr. Ansley is the new president of the company, thought those hours indulgence were too great for seamen, so he went about to reduce them by 1/2, and the other half he looked on his own due by virtue of his post. Some complied through fear of necessity, others rebelled. Basically, the people who did not comply went to the Mogul's merchants, to the loss of both the company's esteem and credit among the trading people of that country. And Hamilton goes on to say many of the sailors actually turned into pirates and then attacked the Mughal ships. Going to the... Okay. So my point here is that the narrative that we're getting from Hamilton disrupts default colonialist or post-colonialist constructions of the experience of English seamen, captains, gunners, and boatswains in 17th century South Asia. And it makes a mockery of Josiah Child's assertion that the Firman, the trading agreement with the Mughal, guaranteed, quote, no Englishman shall serve in the Mughal's dominion, and if any runs away from ships or factory, he's to be seized and delivered up to us. Once again, the tyranny, the improper use of power, the greed are attributes of the East India Company, not of the people of the regions. So that the very virtues of English patriotism, courage, conduct, and navigational skills, those we see up there, are manifest only through the recognition by the Mughal subjects, who are the owners of many fine large ships. So technologically, as well as financially and morally, the Mughal traders occupy the position of the property and benevolent upper class who exhibit precisely the kinds of virtues that the employees of the East India Company lack. Admittedly, Hamilton's book is published 28 years before 1755. But it's indicative of a kind of alternative view to what the company tells us. And it looks back to this era before the East India Company emerged as a military and economic power. How did the company stay in business? Well, there's a parliamentary investigation that revealed that Josiah Child's son-in-law, a guy named Thomas Cook, had been the conduit in 1695 for dispensing more than 100,000 pounds in bribes and another 90,000 pounds in sketchy loans to facilitate the rechartering of the company in 1693. And Nick Robbins' books actually does a good job of pointing out that every 20 years, kind of like Donald Trump, the company is going bankrupt and gets bailed out by some kind of shading dealings, bribing Parliament. When the bribes are dispensed as 100,000 pounds, those are usually dispensed not in cash, but in various forms of future promissory notes from the company. So I want to conclude by talking about symmetrical anthropology. So this is a Chinese translation of my book, which after delays from the pandemic came out. And it's in a series called Early Modern England Global Perspectives, co-edited by Yan Haiping and Martin Pupner. So Yan wrote a 30-page introduction for the book, and Pupner, who saw things that I apparently didn't see or don't see, praised the book for its dual critique of colonialism and post-colonialism. And my translator, the very talented Deng Junwong, added a new title for those of you who speak Chinese, Adoration and Apprehension. So I think here we have a good sense of what happens to even, I think, sincere efforts to try to provincialize Europe, to try to deconstruct economic history, because my friends in China, my readers in China, are reconstructing what I've written, very kind of interesting ways, and seeing things from a perspective that, at least in my conscious mind, I didn't intend. And I encourage precisely that kind of talking back across linguistic, cultural, historical boundaries as we move forward. So, thank you very much.